Hi, I'm Andy Skrei, and today we're going to cover installation basics of advanced analytics. So we've gone through the process of actually deploying our SXB to our appliance, and now we've got the setup wizard UI up and running. So what we're going to do is we're going to configure in our log manager, which is going to be our Exabeam Data Lake, configure our LDAP connection so we can pull contextual information. At the very end, we'll actually start both our ingestion and our processing engines. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. Our welcome to Exabeam setup wizard, we're going to go ahead and hit next. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to configure our log manager. What system do we want to pull from? And here we're actually going to select the Exabeam log manager. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the IP. The port in this case is 8484, and then my username and password. I'm going to go ahead and test that connection. And here we can see that it tested successfully here. So we're going to go ahead and click Add Server to add this as one of our log servers. You also notice up at the top we have syslog ingestion enabled. That means the analytics appliance is set up to receive syslog on the default port and protocol. So on TCP and UDP 514. That can be adjusted if you need to, but by default it's set up to listen on those two ports, or on that port and those two protocols. I also have the ability to add additional log servers in here. So let's say there's a case where the customer has Splunk and they're augmenting their log collection with the Exabeam Data Lake. Maybe they're bringing in their DHCP, DNS, firewall, or EDR solution into Data Lake. I could go ahead and configure a secondary log source to fetch from. So that way we can merge two different data lakes into, or log sources into the Exabeam Advanced Analytics. Now that I have my log server selected, I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And we're going to set up our training and scoring. So this is telling Exabeam at what point of the data do I want to start to train and build baselines of behavior. And because we're connected into the Exabeam Data Lake, I have the ability to go back and use the APIs to fetch historical log data. So I'm going to actually go and configure this to fetch from January 1st of 2018. And it tells me that we should have about a 15-day training period. That's where we're just going to take 15 days worth of logs, and we're just going to use all of that data to baseline and build those profiles of normal. So that means I'm going to set my classification and scoring date to January 16th. So from January 16th on, Exabeam is going to start to trigger those anomalies. So we're going to compare all of the activities to the historical baseline of normal that we built during training and start to identify those anomalies that occur. I have the ability here to set my configuration to process continually, which will just continue to run in real time and fetch logs as they hit the data lake. The other option is to stop processing on a certain date. You want to use that when you have a definitive time window of logs that you want to analyze. So let's say your customer had a pen test or a red team that happened 6 months ago and they know it happened over a 2-week time period. You could then go ahead and set this stop processing after that 2 weeks when the red team exercise was over. You don't need to continue to fetch and try and run in real time. So we're going to go ahead and process continually and hit next. Now here I'm going to actually select the log feeds that I want to bring into the Exabeam Advanced Analytics. So the first log feed I always go after is my Microsoft Windows authentication events. So Microsoft Windows. And I can see here I have the ability to edit the query. So if for some reason the query doesn't match exactly what the customer has, I can go ahead and edit this. If I somehow fat finger my configuration, I can always revert to my default. I'm also going to keep this to set the fetching at January 1st. So I want to go all the way back to my initial training to fetch all of the Windows data. We're going to go ahead and hit next. And I'm going to hit test query. This is actually going to issue the query that we were just showing there as the default config and run this against the data lake. This is going to fetch the raw log events, tell you how many raw events, how many message files, and how many Exabeam events were built. So we can see this fetched 1,000 raw logs. We then went ahead and we parsed all 1,000 and created 1,000 message files, 4768s and 4624s. And then we built 614 Exabeam events. These are the event types we built: Kerberos login, local login, failed login. So it looks like we have a pretty good spread of events here. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And I'm going to continue to add additional log feeds into my list. So the next log feed I want is Windows failed authentications and account lockouts. I'm going to go ahead and hit next. Now, in some cases, I may have a log feed that isn't very high volume. So I can actually hit my more options here, and I can change how far back in time I want to do this test fetch and how many events I want to return. So I could actually say, well, let's go back 30 days, and I want to get 5,000 events. And I go ahead and hit OK, and I can test this. So now we're going to go back a longer period in time and try and fetch more events. This is typical when you're looking particularly at security alerts. In some cases, you're not going to have a lot of security alerts firing on a daily basis like you will Windows Authentication. So you may have to increase that time period that you go back. You're probably not going to end up with 10,000 alerts, but you may want to go back that 30 days. So here you can see now it's changed. I fetched 5,000 raw logs, parsed all 5,000, and built 718 failed login events within Exabeam. I'm going to go ahead and configure a couple more sources. I'm going to get my Cisco VPN. And I'm not even going to test these because I know they work. And I'm also going to configure a security alert. I'm going to get my Checkpoint Threat Cloud. Now, I have Windows failed and successful authentications, I have VPN, and I have a security alert. This is a pretty good subset or base set of log data to come into advanced analytics. This gives me the visibility of where users are authenticating and also some security alerts to help add context to their activities. Now, any other log feeds I want to bring in should really be driven by a particular use case. So if my customer is interested in things like the rogue insider, that insider threat, I may want things like proxy logs, email logs, something that was going to show me data exfiltration or potentially things of that nature. Versus if I want something like a compromised credential, I may want email logs, but I want them to look at potentially phishing use cases, not exfiltration. I may want process execution to help find malware. So the rest of the log sources that you bring into the analytics should really be driven by a specific use case or need from the customer. So after we've configured the log feeds, we're going to go ahead and hit next. And we're going to get into our incident notifications. So here we can configure different notifications that we want to send out from the analytics. So if I go ahead and hit my setup notifications, I can either send syslog or I can send email. In this case, I'm actually going to configure the syslog. And I'm going to send the syslog back into my Exabeam Data Lake, the same place that we're fetching. So I'm going to go ahead and put the IP in here. I could change the port and protocol if I wanted to, and the level. And then I can tell it what I want to send. Do I want to send system health? Do I want to send notable users? Do I want to send all anomalies? In this case, I'm going to select all. In some cases, there's ways that you want to do this differently. So from a system health perspective, I may want to set up email notifications to my infrastructure team when Exabeam's running out of disk or a service crashes. Notable sessions I may want to send to my L1 analyst. And all anomalies, I like to send all anomalies via syslog to the data lake because this gives me a brand new log feed that I can bring into data lake and start to build visualizations and dashboards around the anomalies to look at them in a different way that analytics isn't analyzing them today. So I'm going to select all, I'm going to save this, and we're going to go ahead and click next. Now, the next portion of my setup is the LDAP authentication. This is the ability for us to bring context data in from Active Directory. So the two main data sources with the analytics are the log data, which we've configured through Exabeam Data Lake, and now it's the contextual data from Active Directory. So we're going to go ahead and put in the relevant information here. I'm going to put in my LDAP server. I'm going to put in my bind and base DN here. And I'm going to test my connection. And my connection passes. So now I've made this authentication into the Active Directory server, and I'm going to go ahead and click Save. I do have the ability to connect to multiple different LDAP servers. So this is important if I want to have a failover from the main LDAP server I just connected to, or if there are multiple domains within the organization. I can connect into each one and pull the contextual data from each different domain. Now that my system is going to be saved here, the next step will be to actually generate the contextual data and do the pull. So we have our server all set up. Now the next step is going to be to generate the context data. So I'm going to hit next here. And what we're basically doing is running an LDAP search query. And this is going to fetch all of the information around identities and assets across the LDAP environment. I'm going to hit generate context. We're doing one big pull up front. Once we have all of the details every single night, we're going to requery LDAP for any delta. So we're not pulling this information down, all of it, every single night. It's just the difference from what we had the day before. So you can see here it's exporting the LDIF file, and then we're going through and generating these individual CSVs. So this is our ability to take this giant LDIF and kind of chunk it up into the relevant key value pair files. So our context is generated, we go ahead and hit next. Now a lot of the rest of the setup is going to be predicated on this context generation. So the next step here is workstations and servers. So we're using the information that we just pulled out of LDAP around the assets in the environment, and we're going to ask you to help us classify the assets that you have. So we're going to break these down based on operating system, and you're going to get a list of assets that meet this operating system. And here you simply just have to let Exabeam know, is this a workstation, is it a server, or is there a potential mix of both in these categories? This helps train the Exabeam machine learning algorithm around asset classification, where we try and understand, is this host a workstation or a server? This information directly feeds that training model and gives it the base subset of data to learn the difference between these two asset types. So these top ones here are all Windows servers. I have data center. This is a server, even though it looks like a workstation naming convention. Exabeam demo, this looks like a mix of both, workstations, server names here. If I come down, what it looks like here is these are all pretty accurate, either a mix of both. Here it looks like I have all workstations. You do need to select at least one group that is all workstations here, so that's finance. So I have a list of my assets, and now I go ahead and hit next. So now this is going to be added to that training data set. Next, we're going to go ahead and set up network zones. Now, this is an option that you can choose to set up or not. It provides a lot of good information and context around IP addresses. So the idea behind network zones is we can assign an IP address to a subnet, right, based on CIDR range notation. So if you give Exabeam a list of CIDR ranges and a corresponding description in plain English, we can tell you where this user is authenticating. These could be offices. So Barbara's authenticating to the Dallas office or the New York office versus just a range of IPs that don't mean anything to your security analysts. Now, I don't have a list to upload, but if I wanted to, I could hit upload CSV, and it'll even tell me what my headers should look like. So my CSV needs to have IP ranges and CIDR notation, and column B needs to be the zone name. So I could go ahead and import that. I could then add to that imported list if I wanted to additional subnets, or I could build this all up manually here by just clicking the add and adding in manually subnets and descriptions. The next section is around asset groups. So asset groups is the ability for Exabeam to treat multiple different assets as a single asset. And if you think about this, we do this automatically with Exchange servers. In most organizations, I don't need an anomaly detection to occur when my users authenticate off of a different Exchange server or their mailbox does, right? To me, my Exchange servers are all the same. They're load balanced. So in the case that you have other systems that are load balanced like an Exchange server, or you have a VDI environment where users have virtual workstations and the naming convention of their assets is going to change on a daily basis, we can go ahead and build asset groups to go ahead and treat these as the same asset or type of asset. And we do it through regex patterns. So I could go ahead and click a new asset group. I could call it VDI. And I could say I want this to be, maybe it includes CTX, right? That's my regex. And I could test it out here. And if I hit test, I'm not going to find anything because this is actually looking, again, at the contextual information we pulled, and I don't have any Citrix servers or machines in that particular context pull. But we could go ahead and add this in as an asset group. We click next. Our next step is to configure our peer groups. So not only do we baseline and learn behavior for a single user, we're also going to compare that user to their peers. And so we can select a single peer group attribute, something out of Active Directory like the title, manager, department. In each of these cases, it'll tell us how many groups exist within Active Directory and what percentage of users are covered by that attribute. So we could select one of these, or we can select all and also turn on our dynamic peer grouping. So this is going to allow a user to be part of multiple peer groups. And Exabeam Analytics is also going to learn which peer groups the user should be assigned to based on behavior. It's not just going to be the static attributes here that we have out of Active Directory. We can start to learn things like what applications does the user use and start to peer group them that way. So I'm going to select dynamic peer grouping and hit next. And our next portion is going to be to set up our executives. So all we're going to need here is the CEO's name. We're going to plug that in. And we can go between 1 and 4 levels of direct reports and classify those users as executives within Exabeam. They're actually going to get an executive user label, and that's going to drive additional anomaly detection capabilities. So we talked earlier about how Exabeam learns asset ownership. So we're going to start to assign ownership of assets to your executives. And then we can start to look at users who are not executives accessing executives' assets. Those might be things that we want to know about from a threat perspective. So here I'm going to go ahead and type in Tim, because Tim Cook's our CEO. And I'm going to go ahead and find direct reports here. I have 3. I might want to expand this. Let's go 3 levels deep. I have a few more. So I'm going to go ahead and keep this with 3 levels deep. Now, if there are executives that are missing from this list that you want to be added, you can simply modify this CSV through the command line. You're also going to see we have an executive admin here listed as an executive within this list, right? And that's because she's a direct report. Now, I like to keep executive admins as part of my executive user list because they typically have access to the same sensitive information their executives that they work with have. We're going to go ahead and hit next. And our next step is going to be to configure our service accounts. And again, this is going to be using that data that we fetched out of Active Directory. We're going to ask for an OU where service accounts exist. So within the analytics, we're going to treat users, human users, and service accounts slightly differently. They have different login patterns and behaviors. So I want to know which users are my service accounts so I can look at things like, do I have service accounts VPNing in or interactively logging in? So here we can look at the different OUs that we have within Active Directory. And for us here, we have a service account OU. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. I can select multiple OUs here if there are multiple OUs that match and have service accounts. Now, that's pretty much it from a setup perspective. We've already configured the logs and the contextual information. The last pieces of the setup process here are to configure the users who access Exabeam and what roles we want to assign to them. So we're going to jump to the role-based access control portion. So now we're in our user management. So you can see here that we have a bunch of default roles on the far left-hand side, and if I click on these roles, the actual permissions will show up on the right-hand side that they have. So you can see we have an administrator role. So the administrator within Exabeam is only has access to the setup wizard that we've been going through. They don't have access to the actual UI, which shows the anomaly detections and the user sessions. The auditor is pretty much a standard read-only account within Exabeam. I have a data privacy officer, and this is the role if you have data masking or obfuscation turned on, only the DPO or data privacy officer is able to see the unmasked data. And then I have two levels of analysts. I have a tier 1 and a tier 3. Now, the tier 3 has more permissions, obviously. They have things like they can accept sessions, create watch lists, those kinds of activities. So I can use all of these default roles, or I could create my own role and set new permissions. So if I hit create roles here, you can see I can go ahead and set the different permissions that I want this particular role to have. But I'm going to keep the default roles, and we're actually going to set up a new local user. So I'm going to click Next. You can create local users within Exabeam or configure it to use LDAP authentication. In this case, we're going to create a new local user. I'm going to click Add User. I have the ability to do local as well as CAC here, but I'm going to go ahead and create a local user. And after I put in the password here, this is a one-time password. So when you give this gentleman, Andy, or myself, when I try and log in for the first time, it'll automatically make me reset my password. So you don't have to worry about making it super secure right up front, but it does have to meet all of the password requirements. And I'm going to give this user admin as well as tier 3 analyst. And I'm going to go ahead and click Next. In this case, I'm going to skip setting up the LDAP authentication. And you can have a mix of both. So you can have the LDAP authentication as well as some local users. So here we go. It says, congratulations, we've already successfully configured Exabeam Advanced Analytics. Right? That doesn't take a long time to set up this product, and that really drives the quick time to value for our customers. Now what we can do is go ahead and start the Exabeam engine. What this is going to do is it's going to start our two main engines. One engine that up front is Lime, right? That's the log ingestion and message extraction. So this is going to start to use the APIs into Data Lake to fetch the data as well as parse it. And then the other engine that we just started is our analytics engine. Once we have the data parsed in the message.gz files, the analytics engine is going to pick up those message files and start to process them, stitch the sessions together, build the data models, and generate the anomaly detections. So if I go ahead and I click Finish here, this is actually going to take us now to our main dashboard. We can start to see here, we'll start to see these values changing as we build sessions and bring on events. If I scroll to the bottom here, you'll start to see, once all the engines start, how far we've processed and where we are. If I need to get back to that setup wizard, I can simply come to my menu in my cog, and I can go to my admin settings. I can then scroll down to the bottom here, and under admin operations, I have a few different options. I can go to my engine, and I can see here the history, and I can see that I started my, my Lime and my processing, and I can see the log files that are being applied to it. I could go ahead and I could restart either of my engines from here through the UI. And the other option I have under admin options is my Exabeam rules. This gives me the ability to look at all of the different rules, both factual and anomaly-based, that Exabeam ships with out of the box. I can expand any of these categories, and we haven't actually processed any data yet, but we'd be able to see how many times this is triggered. We can see the overall risk score. So I can modify rules here. I can even create my own fact-based rules through a wizard as well. So now is the point of the time in the product where we just have to wait and let it fetch data. You can start to see now at the bottom, we're training from January 1st. We're basically just starting here, 0 events per second. We're still fetching the data from Data Lake and waiting for it to be processed. But you can start to keep an eye on how the data is processing. And as it processes in real time here, this UI will fill. You'll already notice that our executive users watch list has been filled out based on the setup that we did, as well as service accounts. So this is really all it takes to set up the advanced analytics. It's just simply bringing in the log feeds, configuring the context, and now we wait for the data to fetch and to process. So that's setting up Exabeam Advanced Analytics.